also share the chairman's prediction that we're going to have record years in our national parks and visitation this year. As it warms up in Montana, and sometimes it takes a while to do that, as we had snow last weekend in my hometown in the Gallatin Valley, our smaller parks, like Big Hole National Battlefield, are beginning to see visitation rise again. I look forward to discussing more about how we can drive visitation to these smaller parks. And it's not just about the visitation numbers. I also want to examine how the parks and our gateway communities worked together during last year, and how we can learn from our experience to strengthen relationships between our parks and our gateway communities. The state of our parks also means the state of our park employees, the concessionaires, and all those who live and work in our parks. Employee morale, employee housing, employee health are all things I've heard about recently. I'd like to hear updates on what the park is doing to ensure a happy and a healthy workforce. Furthermore, concessionaires have had an unprecedented year, and we need to ensure that as we move forward, we address any issues that arose from last year's park closure. With that, I'll turn it back to the chairman. I look forward to a good conversation here today.
Thank you, Senator Daines. I'd like to point out that there are a series of pictures around our hearing room today, some of which show the beauty of our national parks, not surprisingly. One is in Maine and one is in Montana. It's just a coincidence, actually, I think, Senator. But also some of them show lines of automobiles and people lined up in order to try to have access to these wonderful places, which is one of the questions we'll examine today, but also in a hearing later this year. I first want to ask to join us Mr. Ken Burns from the state of New Hampshire, which has the virtue of being next door to Maine. And Mr. Burns really introduced the world to America's national parks, and did so in an extraordinary, beautiful way with his partner, Dayton Duncan. Ken Burns, thank you for joining us, and we look forward to your testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and neighbor. Very grateful to be invited, an honor, in fact, to testify before your committee. I should say at the outset that I am not an expert on the current state of the national park system or the impacts of COVID-19. My life's work has been in telling the history of this nation, but I am a firm believer that our shared and complicated past has things to say and many lessons for the present. Our national parks are a treasure house of superlatives, more than 80 million acres of the most stunning landscapes anyone has ever seen, from the continent's highest mountain in Alaska to groves of the world's tallest, biggest, and oldest trees in California and Nevada, from a sacred volcano in Hawaii that continuously gives birth to new land in the Pacific to a promontory in Maine that catches the nation's first rays of sun over the Atlantic, from the Earth's grandest canyon in Arizona to the world's greatest collection of geysers in a geological wonderland in Wyoming. And I should add, for your colleague, Senator Manchin, this treasure house most recently includes the spectacular New River Gorge. These are geographies of memory and hope, where countless American families have formed an intimate connection to their land and then passed it along to their children. But they also embody something less tangible, yet equally enduring, an idea born in the United States nearly a century after its founding, as uniquely American as the Declaration of Independence and just as radical. For the first time in human history, we decided that a nation's most magnificent places should be set aside and preserved not for royalty or the rich or well-connected, but for everyone and for all time. My colleague Dayton Duncan and I, both proud to have been named honorary park rangers, like to say that the national parks are the Declaration of Independence applied to the landscape. The writer and historian Wallace Stegner called national parks the best idea we've ever had. Theodore Roosevelt, the nation's greatest conservation president, considered the national park idea noteworthy in its essential democracy, one of the best bits of national achievement which our people have to their credit. like the idea of America itself, full of competing demands and impulses, lofty ideals and imperfect struggles to live up to them. The national park idea has been constantly debated, constantly tested, and is constantly evolving, ultimately embracing historical places that also preserve our nation's first principles, its highest aspirations, its greatest sacrifices, even reminders of its most shameful mistake. Too often, I think Americans tend to take all of this for granted. Saving such places, to borrow a word from the Declaration, seems so self-evident. We mistakenly assume that doing so is easy, also automatic. History tells us otherwise. The history of every national park is usually the story of individual Americans who fell in love with that place so completely that they decided it should be preserved so that all Americans, in generations they would never know, could have the same chance to see it with the same fresh eyes. It was always a struggle. It was never easy, but the victories made us a better nation. As we made our documentary on the history of the national parks, Dayton and I played a thought experiment with each other. Imagine the United States without the national parks. Yosemite Valley could just as easily have become a gated community with a private golf course in the center. The rim of the Grand Canyon could be lined with trophy homes, each one with a keep out sign, preventing you from gazing down into that awesome chasm and feeling connected to the eons of time. The Everglades, with its abundantly diverse wildlife, could have been drained and made into shopping centers. Yellowstone could have become an amusement park called Geyser World. Fortunately, beginning in 1872 with the establishment of Yellowstone as the world's first national park, your predecessors in previous Congresses pointed the arc of history in a different direction. In the midst of the Great Depression, thousands of destitute young men found employment in the Civilian Conservation Corps to help them and their families survive by working to improve the national parks. Following World War II, when millions of reunited families loaded up in their station wagons and set out to enjoy the parks and overwhelmed the facilities, Congress and the Park Service embarked on Mission 66 to build better roads and visitor centers to accommodate the crowds. And I want to congratulate and thank many of you who last year passed the landmark legislation and funding to address infrastructure and maintenance backlog in the parks that had been growing for decades. There's still obviously more work to be done. At the heart of the national park idea is the notion that every American, whether their ancestors came over on the Mayflower or were here to begin with, or whether they just arrived, whether they're from a big city or a farm, whether their father runs a factory or their mother is a maid, every American is a part owner of some of the best seafront property in the nation. They own magnificent waterfalls and stunning views of majestic mountains and gorgeous canyons. They have a stake in making sure that, as Theodore Roosevelt also said, these places are preserved for their children and their children's children forever, with their majestic beauty all unmarred. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Burns. That was beautiful. I think you've given us a new term that will go into use around here, Geyser World. I think that's one we don't want to remember. Our next witness is Sean Benj from the Department of who is the acting director of the National Park Service. As I mentioned, he's been with the Park Service for over 30 years. Mr. Benj, I don't envy you following Ken Burns, but give us an update on the status of the Park Service and the parks as of the beginning of the 2021 summer season.
Yeah, it's a hard act to follow, Senator. Chairman King, Ranking Member Daines, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to discuss the state of the park system, including the impacts of COVID-19 on operations, staff, visitation, and facilities. The last 14 months have brought unprecedented challenges to our nation and to our national parks, but they've also shown a spotlight on the importance of parks as spaces for physical and mental health, as well as places to reflect who we are as Americans and who we want to be. In the early weeks of the pandemic, most parks closed their interior spaces, but many retained some level of outdoor visitor access. While overall visitation dropped by roughly 28% system-wide, a third of the national parks posted months with record visitation. A significant number of NPS employees have been on maximum telework during the pandemic, but law enforcement, custodial services, visitor services, research, restoration work, fee collection, and other operational work continues in the field. The employees of the National Park Service have shown remarkable ingenuity and flexibility in finding ways to protect resources and serve visitors during this public health crisis, while also working to mitigate their own risks of exposures. Parks are increasingly open this spring, though some operations will continue to be impacted by limited staffing resulting from public health mitigations. The NPS is proud to take a leadership role in the Department of Interior's pandemic response through its close partnership with the United States Public Health Service. Among its many roles, the Public Health Service provides high-quality scientific advice on a range of new and evolving public health issues to protect and promote the health and well-being of visitors and employees. We expect that there will be significant increases in visitation in many parks as COVID mitigation measures are reduced, vaccination rates rise, and Americans increase their travel. Through the Plan Like a Park Ranger campaign that will be launched tomorrow, the NPS is encouraging the public to make plans in advance, be prepared, and recreate responsibly. In April, the National Park Service released the first service-wide mobile app, which will assist visitors in planning their visit. Reduced visitation and the temporary suspension of entrance fees in national parks beginning in March 2020 negatively impacted fee and concession revenues in FY20, combined loss of approximately $125 million. At the same time, NPS saw some savings as travel costs decreased by $16 million and utility costs decreased by $5 million. The NPS has incurred $16.8 million in COVID-related expenses to date, principally related to supplemental staffing, extra cleaning and hygiene supplies, personal protective equipment, expanded telework capabilities, and virtual visitor experiences. We appreciate Congress's recognition of those impacts by making funding available through the CARES Act. Many of the concessionaires and other commercial services in parks saw significant reduced operations in 2020, similar to trends in the broader hospitality and recreation industry. The NPS engaged in listening sessions with industry representatives to share and gather information and has worked with concessionaires and commercial permit holders to provide relief where possible within the legal framework of concession contracts and commercial permits. 2020 was also a year in which issues around racial justice came to the forefront, including those related to policing. As of March 2021, the National Park Service has over 1,000 body-worn cameras in use at park units, and the National Park Service has worked to develop a robust body-worn camera program for all its officers, including the United States Park Police. The NPS intends to issue guidance to the field that would require all uniformed law enforcement officers to utilize body-worn cameras by the end of 2021. We are grateful to Congress for the recent passage of the Great American Outdoors Act, which represents an extraordinary opportunity for crucial investments in the infrastructure needed for people to have a safe and memorable experience when they visit parks. In FY21, $1.3 billion from the Legacy Restoration Fund has been invested in 51 priority projects. We have also recently awarded $150 million in LWCF funds to increase urban recreation opportunities through the Outdoor Recreation Legacy Partnership Grant Program. We appreciate your ongoing support as we work to protect the special places under our stewardship and welcome visitors during a very challenging time. Chairman King, this concludes my statement, and I would be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Benj. David McDonald is the president of Friends of Acadia and the president of the National Park Friends Alliance, representing a very strong network nationwide of volunteer non-governmental organizations that work with and strengthen the park system. Mr. McDonald, welcome, and welcome to the committee.
Chairman King, Ranking Member Daines, and other members of the committee, thank you so much for the invitation to testify and for having the chance to add the perspective of park partner organizations to this conversation here today. I'm David McDonald. I'm President and CEO of Friends of Acadia here in Bar Harbor, Maine. We're a nonprofit organization that for the last 35 years has been working to preserve and protect Acadia National Park and work with the surrounding communities as well. In that time, thanks to our incredibly committed members and volunteers, we've been able to grant approaching $40 million to the park for a variety of projects ranging from trail restoration, youth programs, climate change adaptation, you name it. It's a really strong partnership, and we're grateful for the incredible work of our colleagues at the Park Service here at Acadia. You know, there's organizations like Friends of Acadia throughout the nation and all through this network and park system They're not just like us. Some are larger, some are smaller, but it's a growing community. And my other hat here today, as Senator King mentioned, is I chair the steering committee for the National Park Friends Alliance. We're an informal coalition that's growing dramatically, 400 members strong. And these entities like to network, share best practices, and compare notes and lessons learned from our respective corners of the system and come together to work with this agency that we all have in common. So my message to your committee here today, coming from both a specific park like Acadia as well as this national view of partners, is that our parks have indeed become more important and more popular due to the pandemic. Likewise, the interdependence of the Park Service and partner organizations has also increased. We really must avail ourselves of every available tool, and in fact, we need to create a new toolkit for the coming months and years to ensure that parks are well-staffed, well-funded, they're preserved, the resources are taken care of, and we make them available for the visiting public for safe and rewarding experiences. Having said that, let me touch on three primary themes of my testimony. First, the pandemic did put tremendous stress on park partner organizations with dramatic reductions in revenue, staffing, and operations. However, our community has been resilient and resourceful, and we remain deeply committed to our mission of supporting parks and serving the expanding constituency that sought refuge out during the pandemic during this past year. Number two, national parks have unfortunately been under-resourced for decades. Park partners have been looked upon as an option to help plug this gap. We sometimes talk about ourselves as providing a margin of excellence in parks. Over time, however, partner contributions have increasingly had to provide a margin of survival. The pandemic revealed the risks of this shift and underscored the absolute importance of Congress maintaining and increasing the funding appropriated annually for the base operating budget of the National Park Service. And my third point is, while funding is always important, in order to unlock the full potential of public-private partnerships with organizations like ours, we must also be willing to create a framework of policies, practices, and authorities at the Park Service and at the Interior that encourage innovation, flexibility, and entrepreneurship that partners can often bring to the table. And I want to thank Acting Director Benj for his support and encouragement in his time in his role. The challenges ahead of us are great. These include the ability to make parks resilient to climate change, to make parks accessible and relevant to new or underserved audiences, to bring technology to bear to enhance a 21st century visitor experience, or to solve the acute shortage of seasonal housing that's plaguing many gateway communities and really limits the park's ability to hire staff needed to run the parks. Here in Acadia, we're going to be short on lifeguards, trail workers, visitor service employees, all because the pandemic has exacerbated the housing market here. A few silver linings have emerged from the darkness of the past year, however. Partner organizations and parks have replaced traditional in-person events and programming with digital versions that have reached new and expanded and diverse audiences. Several folks have mentioned the tremendous bipartisan support behind the Great American Outdoors Act, providing historic levels of funding to address both long deferred maintenance as well as land acquisition needs. As with so many aspects of our lives and society, the pandemic has forced parks and partners to rethink how we do our work and how to deepen our impact and further our respective missions. In order to meet this moment that we face today, when nature and the outdoors and parks are central to many people's perception, their well-being, their health, it's really vital that the Park Service and partners recognize our increased interdependence, our respective strengths, and tap into each other's skills and assets in the months and years ahead. I appreciate the opportunity to be part of the conversation, and all of us in the partner community look forward to being a resource for this committee and the Park Service going forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. McDonald. And I want to welcome Mr. Scott Sosha, who represents the National Park Hospitality Association. Almost all of our national parks have some concessions. A friend of mine runs a horse concession at Acadia, and everything from, I guess, horse riding to hotels and other hospitality facilities. Mr. Sosha, your views, please.
Good morning. Thank you, Chairman King and Ranking Member Daines, for the opportunity to share with the committee our perspective on the state of the United States National Park System. Senator Daines, personally, I'm jealous of the 9 inches of snow that you received last week in Bozeman. I'm Scott Sosha. I'm chair of the board of directors of the National Park Hospitality Association. The association represents small and large businesses that provide amenities and services to park visitors. In addition to my volunteer leadership role of MPHA, I'm group president for Delaware North Parks and Resorts and Travel Hospitality business headquartered in Buffalo, New York. Delaware North operates in 7 national parks and has a presence in Yellowstone and Glacier National Parks. The members of MPHA wholeheartedly support the National Park Service mission to conserve our treasured parks for enjoyment, education, and inspiration. We have partnered with the NPS for more than 100 years. By law, concessionaire services have always been and will continue to be limited to necessary and appropriate services for visitors as determined by the agency. Services include lodging, food and beverage, recreation, Native American arts and crafts, guide services, and more. And the concession community includes leaders in the global hospitality industry, but perhaps more importantly, small businesses that are often multi-generational, very specialized to specific park units, typically in challenging locations, difficult conditions, and often distant from traditional labor markets. As the distinguished members of this committee are well aware, 2020 was a very challenging year. Prior to the pandemic, we anticipated revenues of nearly $2 billion in the National Park System, $150 million of franchise fees paid to the National Park Service, and employment levels of 25,000 people. But all the while, the complete and then partial closure of the parks led to a dramatic reduction in revenues averaging 60%. While some NPHA members were able to access economic recovery provisions covered in the COVID-19 relief legislation passed by Congress, meaningful direct assistance was limited. And because of this, more than 90 operators filed requests with the NPS for reductions in franchise fees, as permitted in our contracts in the event of extraordinary, unanticipated changes to the business. And we're very happy to report that in late March 2021, NPS creatively offered a 2-year contract lengthening to many NPHA members, which provided a critical lifeline. We thank the Department of Interior Secretary Deb Haaland and the senior leadership of the National Park Service for being a thoughtful partner in responding to COVID-19 challenges. While this relief helped many of our members, a few were shut out, and we simply encourage the NPS to find ways to help those who to continue having outstanding relief requests. As we come out of the pandemic, we'll continue to adjust our operations as needed to protect public health, and there are important lessons that we will continue to apply to our operations into the future. In addition to the pressing matters related to COVID-19, MPHA notes that implementation of the Concessions Management Improvement Act, enacted in 1998, deserves review. MPHA applauds recent NPS proposals to modify some regulations written more than 20 years ago and to make the park's concessions programs more responsive to visitors. MPHA worked closely with the NPS in recommending some of these changes, and we look forward to working with NPS and Department of Interior on finalizing these important regulatory changes. We would be incredibly remiss if we did not mention the steadfast work of the members of this committee in the passage of the Great American Outdoors Act. Deferred maintenance efforts pose threats to access, to the environment, and to the safety of visitors to the great outdoors. And GAOA will play a vital role in revitalizing our federal lands. MPHA is engaged with the National Park Service and supports leveraging our resources to not merely end the impact of past budgetary inadequacies, but to implement new systems that will help prevent future deferred maintenance growth. And in closing, MPHA is incredibly enthusiastic about the future of national parks, and we're encouraged by indications that the increasing number of Americans will explore these amazing and special places this coming summer. Thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Sosha. Let me begin questioning. Mr. Bench, what's the status of the Park Service plans for this year with regard to COVID in terms of any kind of limitations, mask requirements, those kinds of things? What's What's the plan for 2021?
Well, thank you, Senator, for that question. I appreciate it. I think it's important to recognize it's an extraordinarily dynamic environment as the progression of the disease changes, and we're certainly in a different place today than we were a month or 2 or 3 months ago. Obviously, our guidance is framed by the executive orders of the President, by DOI policy, and by OPM and OMB guidance. And looking forward and thinking about our ability to welcome visitors, I think we're like any other enterprise. There are probably very few businesses that are operating in the same way, the same level they were pre-COVID, but everyone's on a glide path in a better direction. We have 423 units in the National Park Service, and we're extraordinarily decentralized. Every park is different in terms of where they are in being operational and what they need to be operational. We do believe there are some parks where visitation will increase, and we need to do what we need to do in order to be ready. The plan, like a park ranger, is a campaign that will target trip planning. This will include messages around safety, alternative parks that might be less crowded, and making sure you have a reservation before you leave out. Real-time messaging on congestion is also a tool, so we know the parking lot is full before you get there. And in some cases, we're also considering time entry and limiting numbers.
Will decisions on things like masks be made on an individual park basis, or has the department made a determination based upon CDC guidelines that won't be necessary this summer?
We currently are operating under DOI and OPM, OMB guidance, which is certainly framed by CDC. So it's a changing environment. Currently, if you're vaccinated and you're not required to wear a mask if you're an employee or a visitor in the park.
Thank you. One point that I want to make, and it's awkward to make this point to the acting director, but we need a permanent director. The Park Service hasn't had a director for, I think, 5 years, and I hope that that's something that's under active consideration in the department.
Thank you, Senator. No one would be happier when we get a permanent director than I will be. And I understand Shannon Estenos in her testimony indicated that would be a priority, so I'm confident that the administration is actively working.
Ken Burns, a question for you. You documented the beauty and the transcendent nature of these parks around the country, but one of the problems we're encountering is a kind of inherent tension of loving places to death, where some of the best places, you can't see them, but in our committee room we have pictures of beautiful parks, but we also have pictures of huge traffic jams at places like Acadia and Yosemite. How do we balance public access to the maximum number of Americans with not compromising the experience by virtue of all those Americans coming to visit their parks?
Thank you, Senator King. This is a fundamental question, one we tried to address when our series came out in 2009. It's a difficult one because the parks need to have their constituencies. If there was nobody there and we had none of these problems, chances are the parks would then come under assault from the very American acquisitive nature of things. I look at the lines when I go as a citizen, much the same way that I look at a line standing in my little town in New Hampshire to vote. It means that we are participating in the fullest sense in this democracy. And as I said in my testimony, this declaration applied to the landscape. I think a good deal of the park planning and the release of the deferred maintenance gives us a chance to reinvigorate, maybe not on the scale as Mission 66 did in reimagining the parks, but maybe we have an opportunity to, once again, another generation later, 50 plus years afterwards, to have a new kind of mission that that permits us to begin to handle, and I think digital technology will help, as the acting director suggested, just knowing that that parking lot ahead of you is full, or knowing that that dining room is full, that we have a chance to, as families, as individuals, but also as a country, figure out how best to accommodate all the people. But as I told my impatient daughters waiting for a herd of buffalo to go by in Yellowstone, this was a good line to be in.
Thank you. This is an issue where I think we may have a hearing devoted to just this question of how to disperse our visitors between parks and also within parks in order to relieve this problem. Senator Daines.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Benj, our gateway communities are a vital part of our park system, and ensuring strong partnerships there is very critical. What were your takeaways from the last year, and what steps do you think the Park Service needs to strengthen the relationships between our parks and the gateway communities?
Well, thank you, Senator, and I couldn't agree more. We understand the interdependency between parks and gateway communities and strive to be good neighbors and partners with these communities. The National Park Service leadership and individual park managers continue to look for ways to work together with our gateway community leaders on issues that affect the quality of life of gateway community residents, park employees, and park visitors. This includes public health issues such as traffic flow, parking, event planning, affordable housing, and schools. And I do think we do a very good job in that space, Senator.
Thank you. Mr. Benj and I share the chairman's sentiment that we are grateful that Yellowstone National Park is not called Geyser World. I believe that Yellowstone National Park, and this is the park that, I grew up in the shadows of literally as a kid in Montana over many, many years. They've made a lot of great improvements in employee housing. We can only recruit and retain our very best employees if we have adequate housing and places for them to live. As we come out of this pandemic and out of the day-to-day activities that some are becoming more normal now, how do we ensure our national park employees across the United States are supported and taken care of?
Thank you, Senator. Related to housing, the NPS follows the requirements of the housing program that are set forth by OMB. NPS employees are expected to live in private market housing unless they perform duties that make them required to live in the park, or when affordable housing is not available nearby. We have made it a goal within the National Park Service to eliminate poor housing that exists in terms of quality of housing. I think Yellowstone is a great example of where we have invested a significant amount of money over the last 3 years. And if memory serves me right, we've replaced over 40 units in that particular park. And we're committed to that program and meeting that 5-year goal of eliminating poor housing in the Park Service. Affordable housing, it is becoming increasingly difficult to find in gateway communities, and I certainly understand that and appreciate that situation. I think there are probably parks, or not probably, there are parks where additional housing is required. I think we need to be extraordinarily thoughtful on a park-by-park basis and understanding what that need is, and then being able to address that need, which can include and should include public-private partnerships.
Yeah, and I want to talk with a bit. In fact, we had a field hearing of the Park Subcommittee in Gardner, Montana, one of our gateway communities there, something for Yellowstone National Park, about this very issue. In fact, we had it at the Gardner High School. We have gateway communities for Yellowstone Park that are in Montana, places like Gardner, West Yellowstone, Cook City, where they're surrounded by federal land and they're literally landlocked and unable to expand. So we've got a constraint on ground where we could build additional housing. It's really very difficult to recruit talent both in the community and at the park, as housing prices are high and new houses just simply can't be built. We're out of land. Starting with Mr. Benj, but I'm also happy to hear input from many others on this topic. What options or solutions might we examine to ensure that the parks and the communities can continue to hire and house and retain the best talent.
Well, thank you, Senator. Again, I think it's different in each park in terms of need. I think making sure that we have the appropriate planning and analysis in place to understand what the need is and being able to walk that with the existing inventory is incredibly important. Once we have determined what that need is, I think there are a number of avenues of which we can fill that need. I think one of the things that's nice in that space is that our housing regulations allow for the concept of public-private partnerships in being able to build facilities by the private sector. And there are some constraints related to that authority, but I think it's something we need to explore in those situations where it makes sense.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, I'm out of time, but it's something I think we need to examine is, we love our parks. We've got to take care of our employees. We're out of housing right now in some cases, something we should look at.
I think that's a subject for perhaps some hearing time.
Yeah, thank you.
Mr. Benj, I should have in my introductory comments commented on your people. In 2003, my wife and I took our children out of school for 5.5 months and toured the country by RV and went to 17 national parks. And the people were exceptional. The park rangers, the park personnel, we have wonderful people, and I think a lot of them are mission driven. They clearly were proud of where they were proud of the mission, and I hope you will convey to them, to the people of the Park Service, the admiration, respect, and thanks that this committee knows is due to them. Please do that, please, will you?
Thank you, Senator. I would be happy to do that. We have over 18,000 very dedicated employees that are absolutely mission-driven.
We didn't see all of them, but we saw quite a few of them on that trip. Now we have Senator Hirono by WebEx. Senator?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, you and I think, are the only two people on this subcommittee who have this senior pass to our national parks. Mr. Chairman, you're the person who flashed this, and I said, I want one of those. And the minute I went back to Hawaii, I got one. I think
It's the best deal in America.
Haleakala, right. So there are some benefits to getting more mature, I'd say. So, Mr. Burrs, thank you so much. You're shining a light on the importance of our national parks, and your documentary, I watched it, and it really made everyone, I think, aware of the importance of our national parks. So your presence on this panel is really welcome. Mahalo, as we say in Hawaii. And Mr. McDonough, I want to acknowledge also the importance of the friends groups and cooperating associations in their roles in supporting the national park system, both financially and in-kind services. I have a number of questions for Mr. Benj. While the COVID pandemic has significant impacts on the National Park Service that will take some time to recover from, another crisis is facing our national parks, and that is climate change. Last month, the National Park Service published a document providing guidance to park managers on planning for climate change. And the document provides examples of how parks all across the country are planning for those impacts, including at Hawaii Volcanoes National Park, where efforts are underway to establish populations of rare and endangered plant species to increase their ability to persist as climate conditions change. As NPS works to incorporate planning and carrying out the subsequent projects to address climate change, what kind of additional resources will be necessary to ensure that efforts like those at Hawaii Volcano National Parks will happen?
Thank you, Senator. You know, we are in the perpetuity business, and but I think it's fair to say that our parks are influenced and are changing in terms of the resources we're charged with protecting as a result of a changing climate. And we understand that being able to forecast, understand those impacts, do what we can on the resiliency side, and also be able to protect the resources are our priority. We have spent a significant amount of time and energy looking particularly at coastal parks in terms of vulnerability. and we want to expand that information, that research to parks, every park. So every park has that information in order to be able to use in making good decision-making related to management decisions on resource protection.
Well, the question is, Mr. Bench, do you need additional resources to enable this work to continue, particularly, as you say, in the coastal parks? If you say yes, we can put in some, we can look for some funding or other changes that we need to make.
Yeah, thank you, Senator. It is a priority and a pillar for the current administration related to climate change. And I think as a priority, resources we've made available as a result of the administration's priorities. In terms of additional money that we need today that we don't have, I'm really not in a position. I didn't come with that information. Thank you. But I'd be happy to provide it.
Yes, usually the need exceeds the resources provided. Mr. Benj, as you know, Haleakala National Park has been successfully using a reservation system to ensure a safe and enjoyable visitor experience for viewing the sunrise from the rim of the volcano, something that I've also done. Many parks during the pandemic tried new reservation and time entry systems to better manage the flow of visitors into the parks. So I'm wondering, and this is something that the chairman also referred to, or I think he did. Are there things like plan like a ranger campaign that NPS is launching, where you encourage parks to continue pursuing these new systems beyond the pandemic in order to decrease overcrowding and pressure on resources?
Thank you, Senator. I think the short answer, yes, in terms of trip planning, there's plenty of opportunity on that front beyond the pandemic. When it comes to managing visitors and congestion management, our goal, our ultimate goal, is to provide a quality visitor experience and make sure that we're doing a good job in protecting resources for future generations. Any action that we take in managing people is really measured against those two principles. For example, do we have too many people that the quality of experience is severely compromised in any particular area, or are resources being damaged as a result of too many people? The management actions that we can or do take vary greatly based on the individual circumstances. It could range from proactively encourage visitors to visit less crowded areas through trip planning that would provide similar experiences, all the way to implementing a sophisticated time entry system. Typically, we go through a very comprehensive planning process at the park level that includes pretty robust civic engagement to identify that range of management options before we make those decisions in the long term.
Thank you. I think it's really important that these decisions are not made as top-down kind of a process. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Hirono. Before recognizing Senator Lee, I hope and believe that online watching us this morning is our member emeritus, Lamar Alexander, who lives in the shadow of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. He told me he was going to tune in this morning, one of the real authors of the Great American Outdoors Act, and I just want to acknowledge Senator Alexander's contribution to the work that we're doing here today. Senator Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Benj, as you know, Zion National Park operates a fleet of shuttles to provide people with access to the park. As a result of COVID-related policies, currently these park shuttles are limited to about 30% capacity, about 14 people at a time, and this is something that's dramatically decreasing the number of people who can travel on them at any given time. The park, Zion National Park, is, as you know, entering into a really busy season, and local communities, especially this city of Springdale, is one that relies heavily on the shuttle system to moderate traffic and parking within the town. So when we look at the fact that airline passengers have been sitting shoulder to shoulder for hours at a time on flights for many months, I wonder why it is that passengers wearing masks couldn't, in a short shuttle ride, one in which they could open the windows, why is it that they should have to operate at 30% capacity? So Answer me this, can the Park Service update its social distancing guidance on this point?
Park Service policy, again, is guided by Department of Interior policy, as well as OMB, and it is framed by CDC recommendations. So the answer to your question is it's a very dynamic environment. I mean, it's very likely a month from now it will look different in terms of what those policies look like today versus a month from now. But right now we are framed by the policies of the department.
I understand, and I appreciate that, and I appreciate the fact that the Biden administration has reiterated its commitment to following the science. But can you explain to me what science it is that would indicate that it's safe to fly shoulder to shoulder for hours at a time, but not ride shoulder to shoulder, equally masked in both circumstances, for a 10 to 15-minute bus ride? What's the scientific distinction between those?
Senator, I just don't think I'm the right person from a scientific standpoint to have the expertise to answer your question.
Okay. One of the reasons that this worries me is because we're entering the busy season. This coming Monday, being Memorial Day, is going to be a particularly popular weekend. So is there any chance you could make that adjustment prior to Memorial Day?
If the policy guidance changes between now and Memorial Day, as it relates to OMB and or the department, we certainly would evaluate that and pivot accordingly.
Okay, thank you. The drought that Western states, including my own, have been experiencing is impacting the water level at Lake Powell and the Glen Canyon National Recreation Area. In fact, the water level has gotten so low that it's left both the channel ramps at Antelope Point Marina unusable, cutting off access to concession customers and to dry storage patrons. Meanwhile, the Bullfrog, State Line, and Wahweap ramps will all need temporary extensions. And I certainly want to commend and thank the local park officials for working expeditiously to address the issue. But as we look ahead, Mr. Benj, how do you think we can better prepare for these types of situations?
Well, thank you, Senator. Glen Canyon, I think, welcomes about 4.4 million visitors annually. We are in the middle of a historic drought. No one can predict exactly when it will end or how severe it will be. We are committed to using the most accurate scientific data available to make the best decisions possible. I think it was on May 17th we notified Lake Powell boaters that the State Line launch ramp will be closed to motorized vehicles due to revised projections by Bureau of Reclamation, and lake levels are lowering faster than previously predicted. Alternative launching facilities for motorized vehicles remain in place. We're working with the public and the recreation community to plan ahead as congestion at boat rounds and docks on Lake Powell occurs and as water levels drop. But without question, it is a difficult situation.
As the third most visited national park in the entire country, Zion National Park is, as I indicated earlier, it's important to our state, and it's a fixture of a local tourism economy. It's one that really helps support tourism and it helps generate revenue. At various times, the Park Service has sought to conduct a capacity study that could end up mandating a reservation system. I just want to take this moment to reiterate my very, very strong opposition to any reservation system, and instead request that National Park Service give consideration to locally driven alternative solutions that prepare visitors and that preserve visitor access and enjoyment. So, Mr. Bench, will you commit to collaborating with my office and communities in my state as we help to address system unit needs?
Absolutely, Senator. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Lee. Senator Kelly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Burns, great seeing you again remotely. I'd like to begin by thanking you for your impressive and inspiring PBS documentary about the national parks. National Parks, America's Best Idea. In it, you covered some of the history of the Grand Canyon National Park in the state of Arizona. And It's been 10 years since my last flight into space on Space Shuttle Endeavour, but I'll never forget the first time I saw the Grand Canyon from orbit. Even from hundreds of miles away, it is impressive and majestic, as impressive as it is when you see it up close. Today, there are thousands of uranium mining claims surrounding the park. Senator Sinema and I introduced the Grand Canyon Protection Act, which would permanently protect the area from uranium mining. We believe the risk of uranium contamination to Grand Canyon water supplies, the tourism economy it supports, and the Havasupai tribal members who live there is too great. A recent poll by Colorado College found that 77% of Arizonans support banning uranium mining near the park. And the latest that was recently in some public research. What do you think? What's your opinion? And what do you think causes Arizonans and Americans to rally to protect our national parks?
Well, it's good to see you again, too, Senator Kelly, and if virtually. I'm reminded of the phrase in Ecclesiastes, what has been will be again, what has been done will be done again. There's nothing new under the sun. As you know, one of the principal reasons why President Theodore Roosevelt set aside 800,000 plus acres of Grand Canyon first as a national monument, it would then gain national park status several years later, was to protect it from mining interests. And I think what you find is an overwhelming number of Americans who support, particularly with those existing national parks, the greatest possible protection that we presume they enjoy. And I think many Americans are surprised to see that there are still threats. But again, I would retreat back to my democratic analogy that the freedoms that we enjoy require a kind of eternal vigilance. And I think it's going to be important for those of us who advocate for the protection of the parks, those of us who would want, for example, to expand them. Senator Lee, I was speaking for many years with Senator Hatch about Dinosaur and Dead Horse State Park in Utah, achieving some sort of park recognition or status, national park recognition or status, and elevating Dinosaur to that level. That we're constantly in flux in doing that, and part of our relationship to the parks as citizens has to be in the ongoing vigilance to protect them from, as I mentioned before in my testimony or my answer, the acquisitive interests that are natural to all human beings and to people. There's nothing new under the sun, and these uranium claims have been going on for literally more than a century.
Well, thank you, Mr. Burns, and I think that that vigilance is incredibly important here. And I want to thank my senior senator, Senator Sinema, for introducing the Grand Canyon Protection Act with me, because, mining in and around the uranium mining in and around the Grand Canyon is just a bad idea. In the remainder of my time, I want to switch to Mr. Benj. National parks in Arizona need over $500 million in repairs and replacements in critical infrastructure. And one example of this is the drinking water pipeline built in the 1960s that takes water from the Colorado River to the South Rim. When the 12-mile pipeline fails, which is rather frequent, the park and its visitors lose water. And the National Park Service will soon receive substantial funding provided for deferred maintenance projects under the Great American Outdoors Act that was signed into law last year. Mr. Benj, can you confirm that the Park Service is moving forward with plans to replace the Grand Canyon pipeline?
Working on it together. and want to just thank the chairman for guiding me to Acadia National Parks a couple years ago, and had the pleasure of meeting Mr. McDonald, and I'll give him my first question, the Friends of Acadia. And if I would say here, like you, my wife has a goal of going to every national park in the country, which means that's my goal as well. And with all due respect to all the other parks, I'm not sure if I've been to a more beautiful park than Acadia, as well as Yellowstone gets all the ink, but really Glacier National Park, I've been there 3 times, and just 2 of America's treasures. And as I think about coming out of COVID, one of my big concerns is the mental health crisis. And as a physician, if I could give America a prescription this summer to work on your mental health, it would be go visit a national park. Take a deep breath, go to a national park. It would do more than any medicine or any legislation that we can write up here. So just want to get America out there. And just, I'll start with Mr. McDonald. You guys have been so successful, private world, mingling with the government park there as well. As the Friends of Acadia, actually I believe was the first park that was used private funds as well. What's the secret to your success? What would you pass on to other nonprofit organizations that want to work with national parks?
Thank you, Senator. We have learned so much from our other peers at other parks. This is one of the benefits of the Friends Alliance. I'm pleased by your remarks that you consider Friends of Acadia a leader in this regard. There is a long tradition of private philanthropy here at Acadia. Mr. Burns, in his film, documented how Acadia was the first park created through private donations of land. And that tradition is still incredibly strong. It does come back to relationships and communication and trust and respect. It's not easy always for a federal agency to work outside of their comfort zone or outside of the park boundary, but stretching to include partners in your plans, partnering whenever you tackle a major initiative, agreeing on priorities, that collaboration and communication needs to be wired into the future leaders of the Park Service. We've got a terrific superintendent here. There's many out there that are doing a great job, but being willing to communicate and share the work and share the priorities with the community and with the parks and to problem solve together, and to have the ability to, just tap into people's desire to give back. The parks provide so much to the American people, and organizations like ours just provide a platform for folks to be able to pay it back. Grateful for your interest and support. Please let us know when you're back in Acadia, and let me know if I can help with other questions.
Well, thank you. I'll go to Mr. Binge next. Is perhaps the greatest bargain in America is $80 for a national park pass. And I just noticed that mine has expired, so I need to get another one. How do people get a national park pass?
They can go to the national park website and follow the link to the pass.
There you, so the national website for the parks as well. And we got seniors. Do we have anything special for veterans yet? A special park pass?
For veterans, yes.
So they get a deduction, or is it free for them? Free. Wow, what a great bargain. And one more way to pay tribute to our veterans as well. I think I want to go to Mr. Sosha next. As you get geared up for, I think, will be the busiest summer we've ever had. I just see the enthusiasm out there, all my outdoors friends, and people that have never tasted the outdoors are ready to go. The fishing equipment is sold out at all the stores, and it looks like it's going to be a great summer. How are you all doing for employees? And why? I'm guessing you're being challenged getting people to work like everybody is in the country. What's keeping people from coming to work for your folks this summer?
Sure. It certainly is it's a very tight labor market right now, without question. We're no doubt leveraging H-2Bs and J-1s, international workers, because there's a real need for it. We're offering incentives that we haven't offered in the past in order to retain workers, and I say retain as well as recruit new. Super important. But we believe we're ready. We're excited, and we have some great partnership out there. Yellowstone in particular, just a great superintendent to partner with.
Well, great. It looks like I'm out of time, so I'll yield back. Thank you for being here, everybody.
Senator Marshall, you mentioned your pass as a bargain. This is my senior pass, which is $80 for life. This I think is, as Senator Hirono, this is the greatest deal in America right here. I think it's $80. Is that right, Mr. Bench? I think
That is correct.
it used to be a ridiculous $10, but in any case, that's when I bought mine, as a matter of fact. I think we'll have a short second round of questions. Mr. Sosha, you mentioned something in your testimony that sort of went by very quickly, but I think is important, and that is it's time to review the 1998 Act that governs how concessions work. For example, we learned through experience at Acadia that if a concessionaire bids for whatever the service is, past performance doesn't matter under the regulations. Do you agree that it's time to review that act and the regulations in light of current realities of park operations?
I do. And we spent collectively 2 years between ourselves and the National Park Service to progress it very far down the line to have it placed in the reading room and have it never make it out of the reading room. And since then, we've had conversations with the National Park Service as to how we can progress it forward if there are any changes that need to be made to what we all have collectively come up with.
I think that's something that this committee will follow up on this year.
Thank you.
Mr. Benj, this is too long a question for a short hearing like this. I would appreciate it if the department could supply to this committee, for the record, current plans and operational procedures for the implementation of the Great American Outdoors Act. How are the decisions made in terms of allocation of funds to various parks? How are decisions made with regard to allocation of funds under Land and Water Conservation Fund? And I think that would be a useful update for the committee, given the fact that we're approaching a year since the bill was passed. Can you work with your colleagues at the department to make that available?
I will, Senator. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The other thing, Mr. Benj, I hope that the department, the National Park Service, will work to further online access. If there's anything we've learned during the pandemic, it's the importance of an online presence, both in terms of park passes, park guides, information, real-time information about parks. You mentioned congestion information. I think there's some progress to be made in terms of the digital footprint of the National Park Service. I hope that's on the agenda as well.
Yes, it is on the agenda. It's one of the priorities we're working on. We are proud that we just recently rolled out our first mobile app, which is certainly a step in the right direction.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Mr. McDonald, in terms of advisory, in terms of organizations like Friends of Acadia, what about advisory committees, which I think are a kind of different animal? Are they a useful part of the park administration process?
Thank you, Senator King. I think they are. Any opportunity to provide a forum for local communities, local elected officials to have a say and to have questions and to have a healthy exchange on issues affecting the park. Having said that, I know that some of the administration of the Advisory Commission here at Acadia, how you nominate someone for a term, the paperwork they have to file, that can be a little frustrating, I know, but the concept of a local advisory commission, I think, is very sound, and it helps strengthen that trust and communication that I mentioned between the park and the surrounding communities. I also just want to add on the earlier topic about Great American Outdoors Act, there is a lot going on, and I do want to credit the Park Service for including the partner community in their communications. They are working night and day to implement this. It's a very big lift, and I do appreciate the partner community appreciates being kept in the loop as those decisions are being made and rolled out.
Mr. Burns, before my time expires, I want to thank you again for joining us and for the work you did on behalf of the national parks to introduce not only Americans, many Americans, millions of Americans, but people around the world to this wonderful asset. And I hope you will keep in touch with this committee as ideas occur to you that you believe could be helpful. And I think the other important contribution you made was that the parks have not been without controversy, and many of them were born in controversy. And yet today, Many of those communities where controversies existed could not imagine life without the park. Has that been your experience?
Very much so, Senator, and I'd be honored to stay in touch and offer what advice the committee would find useful. You're exactly right. I think too often we presume that these good things were born out of equally good things, but it's often the tension about what to do with the land. That acquisitive nature looks at a stand of a beautiful forest and thinks board feet. It looks at a beautiful river and thinks dam. Looks at a canyon, Senator Kelly, and thinks mineral rights. And all of that is legitimate and an important part of the growth of our country. But some of it has to be saved, as President Roosevelt had suggested, for our posterity. And I think it's important. And I also want to commend Senator Marshall for bringing up the idea of mental health. Let's remember that the very first Park Service director, Stephen Mather, himself suffered from some mental illness in which only the parks and their soothing nature had some way of calming this inner turmoil. He was absent for a long time. His assistant director, Horace Albright, often took over. And just a decade after Yellowstone was created, there was a debate about whether we should continue with this, and many senators suggested not. George Vest of Missouri said, there should be in a nation that will have, he said, 100 million or 150 million people. A park like this, meaning Yellowstone, is a great breathing place for our national lungs. A great breathing place for our national lungs. Nearly a century and a half later, in a nation of more than 330 million people, now emerging from a lockdown and restrictions and the terrible suffering and anxiety and exhaustions that accompanied that, we need a place for our national lungs to be exercised. And you can find that in only one place, and that is in our national parks and our national park system and the extraordinary work that the National Park Service does. And I'm very grateful to the committee for asking me to come this morning to offer thoughts about the historical perspective of how incredibly democratic this institution is.
Thank you very much, Mr. Burns. Senator Daines.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Burns, your documentaries helped bring to light the beauty of so many of our parks. When visitors come to Montana and visit some of our great parks, oftentimes they'll look at maybe a Yellowstone and Glacier kind of itinerary. But as the chairman pointed out earlier, we have congestion issues in our parks and need to find ways here to maybe relieve some of those pressures. And one of those ideas, perhaps, is to encourage visitors to think about some of our lesser-known parks when they look at their itineraries. My question is, how could we use your tools and your knowledge to highlight and drive visitation to some of these lesser-known parks? In Montana, as an example, the Grant Coors Ranch, we had a field hearing there, actually, a couple years ago, or some of our battlefields like Little Bighorn, the Big Hole, or Bear Paw.
Senator, this is a wonderful, wonderful question, and really at the heart of it, and I'm grateful for the chance to try to answer it. You know, I've spent my entire professional life working in public broadcasting. I've always seen a kind of similarity or comparison to our federal system and to the national park system and what we try to do in public broadcasting. And we've created a lot of educational materials that have accompanied our national parks film, and even though it has now been out for a dozen years, it nonetheless is a very active site, and we work through the PBS Learning Media to continue to educate. So we would be more than happy to go back to the Park Service and certainly work in concert with your committee to try to coordinate that information, because we do need a safety valve as well as a breathing for our national lungs, and a lot of that has to do with sort of intelligent ways of visiting the parks. And we've all experienced the log jams at Glacier or at Yellowstone, but I think the wonders of Big Hole and Bighorn are incredibly important, and I think we can direct our populace there through educational works. And I know, speaking on behalf of the Public Broadcasting Service, that we would be happy to try to share our materials and understanding. In fact, when we finished collecting the thousands and thousands of photographs necessary to research over a decade, Senator, we donated the entire hard drive of those archives to Harper's Ferry, where the Park Service has their archival headquarters, because many of the images they were familiar with and some they were not. And we were able to give to the American people the resource of our 10 years of research. So
No,
we're at your disposal.
I appreciate that, Mr. Burns. I think it's a lack of awareness oftentimes, because I think in the park experience, you want to kind of get away from it all. And some of these hidden gems that we have are a chance to get away from it all, too, and also solve the problem of the congestion and maybe the better known parks.
That's exactly right. And the acting director suggested, we have, 60 so national parks, but we have 420 plus units in the National Park Service, and they deserve a great deal of attention, not just obviously the celebrated major parks.
Think about what PBS, and we have the back roads of Montana. It's kind of the back roads to these smaller, lesser known parks.
I think we've got another program.
We do, I tell you. Mr. Benj, the Great American Outdoors Act was passed in the middle of the pandemic. The chairman talked a little about this as well, about implementation. Can you give us just maybe a sports in brief, quick summary? What's the status of implementation, and what projects are first to get funding from the act?
Yes, thank you, Senator, and I really appreciate that question. I'm pleased to tell you I think we're doing really well. There were 51 major projects that were funded in FY21. And each one of those projects, we developed a project schedule with particular milestones. And when you crosswalk the milestones that we projected in terms of where we are, we're pretty much on target. Our funding list for FY22 will be released with the president's budget. We have, I don't know the obligation rate today off the top of my head, but again, it's on projection. I know that we're working with Yellowstone projects. In Yellowstone, we've got $126.5 million in projects. About half of that relates to housing and historic structures, and the other half relates to road work. And many of our road projects, we complete those in partnership with the Federal Highway Administration.
Great, thank you. My last question for Mr. Socha. It's my understanding that a key update to the concessionaire rules was held up during the transition to the Biden administration. Could you give me an update on the status as well as the importance of that rule?
The status is that the Park Service and the concession community is in agreement, I think, that it needs to move forward. There are some modifications I believe the Park Service would still like to make to what made it into the reading room, which is consistent with our thoughts as well. And we do think it's absolutely important. It's been 20 plus years since the regulations have changed and visitor services and needs have changed and park needs have changed as well.
So, Mr. Benj, would you have a status update from the Park Service as to when that rule will be finalized?
Thank you, Senator. As many folks have mentioned, the current concession regulations were issued 21 years ago. And the NPS is currently conducting a final review of the proposed rule, and we hope to issue a final rule later this year.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for the time.
Well, again, I'd like to thank our witnesses, Ken Burns, David McDonald, Scott Socha, Sean Benj, for a very informative hearing and for your forthcoming answers to our questions. As I mentioned, we will most likely be following up with a hearing later in the summer on the issue of congestion and how to deal with that so that we can maximize enjoyment of the parks while at the same time maximizing access for the American people. Without any further questions, the committee hearing is adjourned.
Oh, absolutely. All right, anything else? With names?
The SLS is a national capability that provides a unique access to space that America has not had in 40 years.
A large launch vehicle like this really opens the door to destinations beyond. It's not limited by destination. It's only limited really by imagination.
What we're focused on here at this center is the propulsion system. And that consists of 2 solid rocket boosters and a core with some tanks that feed some liquid rocket engines in the middle. And then the astronauts sit on the top in the Orion spacecraft.
One of the things we recognized for SLS is we had to be affordable. So we had to do things differently, more efficiently, and smarter.
We're all conscious about saving money, doing it more affordable than we have in the past. But at the same time, we can't sacrifice reliability or safety.
The system uses a significant amount of heritage hardware, which is things that we've evolved from the Space Shuttle program.
The Space Shuttle had 2 kind of candle-looking things, which are the solid rockets. Those are kept, and those are used on SLS.
We've added a segment to the 4-segment solid rocket boosters that we had on Shuttle. That gives it more power, more thrust, and it helps this larger rocket get off the ground. What those boosters are for is just to get you going. They burn for a couple of minutes, and then they fall to the ground. Then your liquid engines, you're up high enough, your liquid engines can carry your vehicle to as high as you want to go, and if you have additional stages, like we're going to have one, then you can go further out into space.
Right now, the inventory that we've got consists of 14 engines that have flown on shuttle. We've got 1 engine that was assembled and still needs green run testing or certification testing. We looked at all the spares. As we collected the spares, we determined that we could assemble a 16th engine. So we'll have 16 engines that we'll be able to use for flight.
We are making tremendous progress. We've got all of our prime contractors on board. We're testing engines, we're testing solid rocket boosters, our avionics systems.
J2X has recently set a record at Stennis. When we were testing, it was the first liquid oxygen engine to get to a full duration test in 4 tests.
We were developing this booster under the Ares program, and we're moving that into the SLS vehicle. The motor itself has been through 3 development firings, which are full-scale motors tested out in Utah, and we've gotten a lot of good data, engineering data from those tests.
This is an adapter that goes between the bottom of the Orion capsule and the top of the Space Launch System rocket that we're developing here at Marshall. It's been specifically designed to give strength to the adapter so that it can take the loads in flight and still be lightweight. This shape started out as a series of flat panels. The isogrid pattern was machined into the surfaces. Then they were formed, it was called in a process called bump forming, to make them into the shape that we need here. And we weld 3 of these segments together to form the cone that you see behind me.
We just, delivered the first crew module to the O&C building at KSC. We've started a lot of the parts onto the outside of the CM, and we've actually put it in what we call the bird cage, so we can locate all those parts, within, thousandths of an inch to make sure that everything is going together okay.
Putting, wiring inside of it, putting tubes for the propulsion system, putting valves and pumps, and so all of that happens in stages right there in the O&C building.
We have on contract with USA, United Space Alliance, to build our harnesses. They're set up shop in the O&C, and so their little shop delivers to the big shop.
Thermal protection is very difficult in re-entry vehicles to test and to model. I mean, really, you have to fly it to really understand what's going to happen. We're building ceramic thermal insulation tiles for the back shell of the capsule. We're building thermal barriers for the capsule, and we're building multi-layer insulation for that capsule.
I'm the heat shield design lead.